Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are taking on a topic that is, well, arguably one of the most foundational and difficult subjects in social science. We're looking at the deeply intertwined concepts of stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination.
Absolutely. Foundational and definitely challenging.
Our sources for this deep dive, they're pretty dense, unflinching, really. They take us from these stark, real-world examples of racial injustice, right through to the complex, sometimes competing psychological theories that try to explain, why humans are so adept at categorizing and differentiating one another.
They really cover the gamut.
It's definitely a heavy subject. There's a lot of historical context. It can be quite emotional, but our mission today really is clarity. We need to move past the noise, the immediate reactions maybe, and achieve absolute clarity on the fundamental structures.
That's the goal, the beliefs, the attitudes, the behaviors that define these phenomena.
Exactly.
That structural clarity is absolutely key. We're aiming to understand the mechanism. We have to look at the foundational concepts, the cultural roots, and importantly, the historical progression of thought, how social scientists have framed how we look at social groups over time.
Right.
Because if we don't understand the components, stereotype, prejudice, discrimination, we can't really accurately analyze their impact, let alone figure out, well, how to address them effectively.
I agree completely. It sounds like we need to sort of strip away the immediate emotional reaction for a moment and really focus on the architecture of it all.
Precisely. The architecture.
Which means, I think, we begin with those grounding examples, some contemporary injustices that show this isn't just history.
Yeah.
Then we'll spend a good amount of time really nailing down those core definitions, S, P, and D, and their subtle relationships.
Which are often misunderstood.
Definitely. And then we can finally dissect the whole evolution of sociological and psychological theories trying to explain it all. Okay, sounds like a plan. Let's unpack this source material. #2. Grounding in the persistence of racial injustice. Okay, so we begin here because the concepts we're about to define, they aren't historical footnotes, are they?
Not at all.
Our sources really emphasize that racial injustice persists. It's happening right now in the United States, and that provides the essential context for all the definitions that follow. These are like live forces shaping things like the legal system, media coverage, even just daily life.
Yes, and that persistence is what the sources highlight, using some incredibly, jarring case studies. They really illustrate how deeply embedded bias becomes when it interacts with institutions of power.
Okay.
The Jena 6 case from 2006 down in Louisiana. It serves as a sort of textbook illustration of how racial tension results in clear, measurable bias against stigmatized groups, specifically within the legal system.
Okay, detail that sequence course again, because it's sort of an escalating timeline of bias, isn't it?
It is. It started, seemingly innocuously enough, at a high school in Jena. The principal appeared to acknowledge that black students could sit under a particular shade tree, a tree traditionally known as the white tree.
Okay. It's acknowledging they could sit there.
Right. The response from some white students was, horrifying, a direct historical threat. They hung nooses from that tree.
Wow. I mean, that's an explicit symbol of racial violence, of terrorism, really.
Undeniably. Yet when the school board reviewed the incident, they categorized the noose hanging as merely a prank.
A prank.
That's what the sources state. The white students involved received brief, minor suspensions. Now, contrast that outcome with what happened next.
Right.
6 black students were later involved in an assault on a white student. They were initially charged with attempted murder. Attempted murder, a felony carrying, decades in prison.
Attempted murder versus a suspension for hanging nooses. And the legal comparison gets even starker after that, doesn't it?
Absolutely starker. The sources note that in a separate, related incident, a white student who attacked a black student was simply given probation.
Probation.
So you have 6 black youths facing attempted murder charges versus minor suspensions or probation for actions by white students that were arguably symbols of profound violence or actual physical attacks. The legal scale in Jena, it seems, was unmistakably weighted. Based on the race of the perpetrators and the victims, it just showcases clear systemic bias.
Yeah, that juxtaposition, the way the source material lays it out, it really drives home that sense of systemic bias. It's not just about, individual bad actors. It's about the institutional reaction to perceived threats based on race.
Precisely. And if we look beyond the legal system, maybe into the media landscape, the sources point to another stark disparity. The coverage of Kent State versus Jackson State back in 1970.
Okay, Kent State, I think most people know that one. 4 predominantly white students killed by National Guardsmen during an anti-war protest. It's a major historical marker.
It is. widely known, widely taught. But just 10 days later, a similar, equally tragic event occurred. Police opened fire at Jackson State University, a predominantly black university. They killed 2 students and wounded 12 others.
10 days later. And the outcome in terms of national recognition or media focus?
Vastly different. The Jackson State event received far, far less media coverage. And this generates that critical question from our source material. Was this disparity due to the racial composition of the universities?
Certainly makes you wonder.
The sources strongly suggest the answer is likely yes. This lack of equivalent outrage, equivalent coverage, it demonstrates how systemic factors, including, media focus, can minimize the pain and injury experienced by marginalized communities. It makes their tragedy somehow less newsworthy in the broader cultural consciousness.
So whether we're talking about the legal system in Jena or the information system with Kent State and Jackson State, the bias seems to operate to kind of protect the dominant narrative and minimize the experiences of minority groups.
And this bias, it has a devastating, measurable impact on the criminal justice system today. It's not just historical examples. We have clear evidence of ongoing racial disparities in law enforcement.
Right.
Black people consistently receive harsher punishments than white people for comparable crimes. And this leads to a drastically higher percentage of the African-American population being incarcerated. It's a well-documented fact.
And if we look for the driving mechanism behind those disparities, does it come back to that core concept we'll need to define later, the cultural stereotype?
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
Strong evidence points to cultural stereotypes specifically, these ingrained beliefs linking black people, particularly black men, to criminality. These stereotypes seem to drive both conscious and unconscious bias against black men at every single stage of the justice process.
Every stage.
From policing decisions on the street to arrest decisions to prosecution choices, all the way to sentencing. It can create this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy where the bias confirms the perceived threat, which then justifies harsher treatment, reinforcing the bias. It's a cycle.
Wow. And this persistent reality, this cycle, it's what fueled, or certainly fuels, modern social movements, right?
Exactly. Following George Floyd's death in 2020, millions protested. That movement, Black Lives Matter, it forced many people, maybe for the very first time, to really confront how deeply and how globally racially biased policing affects black citizens. It brought that abstract concept of systemic bias into undeniable, painful focus for the world. #3, race, culture, and the concept of privilege.
Okay, so to really understand the persistence of the bias we just outlined in those examples, we have to analyze the very categories that society uses to operate. Our sources note that when you first meet someone, your brain almost instantly focuses on 3 primary characteristics.
That's right. The big 3. Race, gender, and age.
They're like the primary social categories we use to filter and process information about others.
Instantly. And we really must start with the first one, race. Race is defined in the sources as a system for classifying human beings. It's grounded in the belief, and this is absolutely critical, that people embody inherited and fixed biological characteristics that determine their group.
But the crucial insight, the thing our sources just hammer home again and again, is that race is a social category, not a biological one.
Exactly. It's a construct of culture, of society, not biology.
That distinction feels paramount.
It is. It sets the stage for everything else we'll discuss. Biologically, the idea of fixed, distinct human races has been completely invalidated by genetics. There's more genetic diversity within supposed racial groups than between them.
Right.
Yet socially, race remains this incredibly fundamental and powerful basis for group division, for inequality, for how we interact.
Yeah.
And we can actually see its fluidity, its constructed nature throughout history.
Okay, give us some of those examples again that illustrate how flexible the concept really is.
Well, think about Irish and Italian immigrants in the early 1900s in the U.S. They faced intense prejudice. They were often viewed by this sort of Anglo-Saxon establishment as biologically inferior, almost occupying this ambiguous middle ground between white and black.
Really? Not considered fully white?
Not initially, by many. Today, of course, they are firmly situated within the category of whiteness. That boundary shifted. Or consider how attitudes toward people perceived as Middle Easterners dramatically shifted and hardened after September 11th. That led to widespread recategorization based primarily on perceived cultural threat and appearance, not genetics.
So the boundaries move based on social conflict, cultural context, perceived threats. It proves the category is determined by social agreement and, frankly, power structures.
Exactly. And the concept itself is surprisingly recent in historical terms. The term race wasn't even really used in the English language to refer to groups of people in the way we use it now until around the 1600s.
That late.
Relatively speaking, yes. And think about this. When segregation was legal in the United States, race was literally defined by specific changeable laws. The one-drop rule, for instance. People could, and did, petition courts to legally change their racial classification if their ancestry was ambiguous or contested.
You could petition a court to change your race.
Yes, which tells you something fundamental. If race were a fixed, immutable biological truth, no court on earth could possibly alter it. Its very definition was subject to legal and social negotiation.
Okay. So race is this kind of artificial scaffolding society uses to group people. How does the broader concept of culture then influence and reinforce that scaffolding?
Culture is huge here. Culture is defined as that unique meaning and information system. It's shared by a group, and it's transmitted across generations. It's the whole framework that governs everything, our norms, our values, our beliefs, our practices.
And its function is basic, right?
Yeah.
Survival, happiness.
Pretty much, yeah. Meets basic survival needs, allows for the pursuit of happiness and well-being, and helps groups derive meaning from life. It gives us our lens on reality.
But our sources point out that this very framework, this cultural lens, is also a breeding ground for stereotyping and prejudice.
It absolutely is. Culture reinforces SPD stereotyping, prejudice, discrimination for several interlocking reasons. First, group members hold common beliefs, and that shared reality lends powerful validation to stereotypes. If everyone around you seems to believe it, it feels true.
Right, social proof.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Second, people operate almost entirely within their cultural context, and often they're completely unaware of its profound influence. It's just assumed to be the way things are, the default reality.
The water to a fish.
Precisely. Third, culture constantly reinforces the use of those social categories we talked about, race, gender, age, and perhaps most importantly, the cultural beliefs themselves. The shared narratives, the common stereotypes, they actively work to maintain existing social hierarchies. They justify the status quo and the power held by the dominant group.
That justification of hierarchy leads us right into the concept of group privilege. It's like the tangible, unearned benefit that comes from being in one of those culturally preferred categories.
That's a good way to put it. Privilege is defined as an unearned favored state. It's conferred simply because of one's race, gender, social class, sexual orientation, etc. The key word there is unearned.
Not something you worked for.
Correct. It's gifted by the system, by the cultural structure. And here's the difficult truth the sources really emphasize. Privilege for one group necessarily entails a loss or a disadvantage for other groups. In many ways, it's a zero-sum structural reality within that hierarchy.
And the most discussed example, certainly in the U.S. context, is white privilege. The sources note that white people seldom have to even consider how their race affects their daily life. It's just the default setting, the norm against which all other is measured.
And that very lack of necessary consideration is a core aspect of the privilege.
Yeah.
Just not having to think about it. However, when people who hold this unearned advantage start learning about inequality and privilege, maybe in a class or through discussion, it can feel incredibly challenging, confronting.
Yeah, I can see that.
It often leads to defensiveness or maybe the feeling that they're being personally attacked because it fundamentally challenges a worldview that might be centered on pure meritocracy. The idea that everyone succeeds solely based on individual effort.
That cognitive dissonance, that clash between the belief in, say, fair play and the reality of unearned advantage, that seems like a huge barrier to understanding. How do the sources suggest we address that resistance?
It's a really important point. They introduced the concept of critical hope, which was coined by Bowler back in 2004.
Yeah.
It's framed as a critical perspective on the process of learning about injustice.
Okay. Critical hope, what does that involve?
It starts by acknowledging the difficulty, acknowledging the pain even, involved in accepting that your group's advantage might come partly at the expense of others. It basically says, yes, this is hard. This might hurt your worldview.
Okay, so it validates the difficulty.
Exactly. But the hope part demonstrates that genuine intellectual and moral growth happens precisely when you allow that potentially flawed worldview to be, well, shattered, or at least significantly challenged. It reframes that uncomfortable, painful moment not as a personal indictment, but as a crucial opportunity for profound cognitive restructuring.
Ah, so the discomfort is actually a sign of potential growth.
Potentially, yes. A growth that can lead to less prejudiced attitudes and a more accurate understanding of social reality over time.
That's a powerful idea that resistance to learning about privilege isn't necessarily like a moral failing in itself, but maybe a difficult cognitive barrier, one that requires patience, empathy, and a pathway toward growth rather than just condemnation.
Exactly. It suggests a more constructive approach to difficult conversations.
We need to remember that perspective, I think, if we want genuine progress. Okay, so having grounded ourselves in the reality of injustice and this idea of privileged categories, it feels like it's really time to define our core toolkit. If we're going to talk accurately about SPD, we absolutely need precision. Let's clearly separate these three primary concepts. Based on their core components, belief, attitude or emotion, and behavior.
Right. Let's nail these down. We start with stereotypes. At their very core, stereotypes are beliefs and opinions. Beliefs about the characteristics, the attributes, the likely behaviors of members of particular groups.
Okay, beliefs and opinions, where do they come from?
They originate from shared beliefs that are just part of the culture we inhabit. They're learned, they're absorbed from media, from family, from peers, from the environment.
They simplify a complex world, right? Which is maybe why our brains find them so, I don't know, attractive, efficient.
Definitely efficient.
Hmm.
They are essentially cognitive shortcuts. Our brains like patterns and categories. Now, they're often noted to contain a kernel of truth.
What does that mean, kernel of truth?
It means there might be some small, observable group difference, perhaps a statistical overrepresentation in some area that gets exaggerated and overgeneralized to feed into the stereotype.
Mm.
But even if there's a tiny grain of accuracy somewhere, they are still fundamentally gross simplifications that completely ignore individual variation within the group.
Got it. So they oversimplify.
Massively.
Yeah.
And crucially, they're both descriptive, they describe what group members are supposedly like, and also prescriptive.
Prescriptive. How so?
They prescribe how group members should be like or how they should behave. They set expectations, often dictating what's considered appropriate behavior for someone in that category. And yeah, while sometimes stereotypes can appear superficially positive, the example often used is all Asians are good at math. They're still limiting. They're still simplifications that box people in and deny individuality.
Okay, so stereotypes are the blueprint, the beliefs, the cognitive shortcuts, maybe with a tiny, distorted kernel of truth. Where does the emotional charge come in? Where does prejudice fit?
Prejudice is the next layer. It's defined as an attitude directed toward people solely because they are members of a specific social group. And it is intrinsically fundamentally based in emotion.
Emotion, okay, that's the key difference. Belief versus feeling.
Precisely. Prejudice is the feeling you attach to the belief, to the category. You can theoretically hold a stereotype, know the cultural belief, without feeling prejudice, personally endorsing the negative feeling, but prejudice generally relies on that categorical belief as its foundation.
Where do these strong negative attitudes, these prejudices, originate? What fuels the emotion?
Well, the sources suggest it's multifaceted. They can stem from perceived threat of fear, rational or not, that another group might compete for resources, status, or power.
Okay, competition.
They can also stem from feelings of disgust towards certain groups that are perceived to violate important social norms or values. And interestingly, prejudice levels are often correlated with specific personality traits.
Ah, you mentioned one earlier, right-wing authoritarianism, RWA.
Exactly. RWA is a personality variable consistently linked to higher levels of prejudice against various outgroups.
That term, RWA, it gets thrown around a lot. What does it specifically entail according to the research context here?
Based on the classic research, RWA is defined by three core interrelated characteristics. First is conventionalism, a strong adherence to social conventions and norms, particularly those endorsed by established authorities.
Okay, follow rules.
Second, authoritarian aggression, a general hostility and punitiveness toward people who deviate from these conventional norms, toward perceived outsiders.
Right, punish difference.
And third, authoritarian submission, an uncritical acceptance of and submission to established authorities, a belief in obeying orders. Individuals who score high in RWA tend to see the world in very rigid black and white categories, and they seem emotionally predisposed to prejudice against groups they feel threaten that establish social order.
Okay, that makes sense. So we have the belief, stereotype, we have the attitude, emotion, prejudice. That leads us logically to the observable action, discrimination.
Exactly. Discrimination is defined as treating people differently from others based primarily on their group membership. It's the behavior that often results from the combination of holding a stereotype and feeling prejudice.
So S is belief, P is attitude, D is behavior.
That's the simple mnemonic. And discrimination can manifest in many ways. It can be verbal think, Microaggressions, insults, derogatory jokes, or it could be behavioral, avoiding someone, denying service, unfair hiring practices, physical violence, and it occurs across all scales of society, from individual interactions right up to cultural norms.
Okay, so for you listening, let's lock this in. Stereotypes are based on beliefs. Prejudice is based on attitudes or emotions. Discrimination is based on behavior. Got it.
But, and this is a huge, understanding that distinction is crucial because the actual relationship among SPD and the real world is, well, it's messy, it's complex.
How so? It seems linear. Belief leads to feeling, leads to action.
It seems linear, but it isn't always. Critically, knowledge of stereotypic beliefs does not automatically equal prejudice in an individual. My brain might store a cultural stereotype. I might know what the stereotype is, but my conscious will can reject it. I might not personally endorse it or feel negatively toward the group.
Okay, so you can know the stereotype without being prejudiced.
Correct. However, it gets more complicated because of implicit processes.
The unconscious activation. We touched on this.
Right. Those stereotypic beliefs, the ones stored in our memory, can be activated without our conscious awareness. And that automatic activation, our implicit system, can influence our behavior, even if we consciously report very low levels of prejudice, even if we genuinely believe we're fair-minded.
So my unconscious biases, fueled by cultural stereotypes I might consciously reject, can still make me act in discriminatory ways.
That's what the research strongly suggests. This was the brilliant, landmark finding of Patricia Devine's 1989 study. It really changed the game.
Devine's study, yes. It really separates knowing the stereotype from actually accepting or endorsing it. Walk us through her findings again, because they're so fundamental.
Okay. Devine tested college students. She first categorized them based on their explicit levels of prejudice toward African Americans, using standard attitude questionnaires, so high prejudice and low prejudice groups, based on what they consciously reported.
Right.
Then she asked all of them, regardless of their prejudice level, to list characteristics associated with the cultural stereotype of African Americans at that time. What she found was startling, really.
What was it?
Both the high prejudiced individuals and the low prejudiced individuals were equally knowledgeable of the cultural stereotypes. They knew the same negative content associated with the group.
So knowing the stereotype wasn't the difference between the groups.
Exactly. The difference wasn't the information they possessed in their heads. The difference was what they did with that information. The high prejudice people essentially accepted the stereotype as reflecting reality. They endorsed it. The low prejudice people, however, consciously chose to reject that stereotype. They actively inhibited that automatic belief.
So they had to expend cognitive effort to override the cultural learning.
Precisely. It takes active mental work to say, I know the stereotype exists, but I don't believe it and I won't act on it. This highlights that crucial difference between explicit and implicit prejudices.
Okay, let's define this clearly. Explicit versus implicit.
Explicit attitudes or prejudices are the ones people are aware of. They can articulate them, they can report them on a survey, and they can generally control expressing them. It's your conscious belief. Implicit attitudes or prejudices are different. They are reactions toward groups or individuals that occur more automatically, often outside of conscious awareness or control. They're often driven by those deeply learned cultural stereotypes that get activated quickly before our conscious mind can necessarily step in and correct them.
And these implicit biases can still lead to discrimination, even in someone who explicitly disavows prejudice.
Yes, that's a key takeaway from decades of research now. And since discrimination isn't just about one person being unfair to another, we also need to look at the systemic consequences of both implicit and explicit bias. Our sources define 4 different types or levels of discrimination that operate at increasing scales.
Okay, 4 levels. Let's break them down.
Starting with the most immediate, the most personal is interpersonal discrimination. This is basically one person treating another person unfairly based primarily on their group membership. An employer not hiring someone because of their race, a teacher giving an unfair grade based on gender, someone telling a racist or sexist joke, a store clerk following a black customer around. Direct person-to-person unfairness.
Okay, simple enough. What's the next level up?
Next, we have organizational discrimination. This refers to the practices, the rules, the policies of formal organizations, think corporations, government agencies, universities, hospitals, that end up having discriminatory outcomes, even if the policy itself doesn't explicitly mention race or gender.
Give an example.
Okay, think of a company that relies exclusively on employee referrals for hiring. If their current workforce is overwhelmingly white and male, their referral pool will likely replicate that demographic. systematically disadvantaging applicants from other groups, even without intending to. Or a seniority system for layoffs that disproportionately affects recently hired minority employees. The rule itself might seem neutral, but the outcome isn't.
Got it. So the organization's standard operating procedures can discriminate. Then we scale up again to institutional discrimination. That sounds broader than just one company or school.
It is broader. Institutional discrimination involves the norms, the policies, the practices that are associated with a major social institution. We're talking about the entire housing market, the education system as a whole, the legal system, the healthcare system. When the standard practices within these massive institutions result in different outcomes for members of different groups, that's institutional discrimination.
So like redlining in housing or disparities in school funding based on property taxes or racial profiling in policing.
Exactly. Those are classic examples. It's the entire infrastructure of a sector of society producing unequal results, often built on historical disadvantages.
And the broadest level of all.
That would be cultural discrimination. This occurs when one group, typically the dominant group, retains the power to define the entire culture's value system. Their norms, their values, their history, their language become the accepted standard, the default norm.
How does that lead to discrimination?
It automatically marginalizes any groups that fall outside that definition. Their cultural practices might be seen as strange or inferior. Their histories might be ignored or misrepresented in education. Their perspectives are devalued. The culture itself systematically disadvantages and devalues the experiences and norms of marginalized groups because the very definition of what's good or normal is set by the dominant group.
Wow. Okay, so discrimination operates from the personal all the way up to the entire cultural value system. That's a lot to contend with.
It shows how deeply embedded these issues can be.
So this whole structure we've outlined, stereotyping, prejudice, discrimination at all those levels, it's clearly not just limited to race, is it?
Not at all. The sources are clear on this. The targets of prejudice are incredibly varied.
What are the main categories they list?
Well, obviously, race and ethnicity are huge, but also gender and sexual orientation, age, both young and old, actually, ability and disability, physical appearance, social class, it's classism, and religion. Basically, any group distinction can become a basis for SPD.
Given that huge variety of potential targets, the sources immediately introduce a concept that feels essential for understanding complexity: intersectionality.
Yes, intersectionality is crucial here. The core idea, developed initially by Black feminist scholars like Kimberly Crenshaw, is that people belong to many social groups simultaneously.
Yeah.
You aren't just your race or just your gender or just your class. You're the intersection of all of them.
And to understand how someone is viewed or how they experience advantage or disadvantage, you have to consider all those intersecting identities together.
Exactly. You can't just add them up linearly either. The intersection creates something unique. If a person holds multiple identities that are devalued or stigmatized by society, the prejudice they face isn't just doubled or tripled, it's qualitatively different. It's a unique matrix of oppression.
Right. And the sources make another critical point here. Social categories, the very definitions of them, are often implicitly based on the stereotypes of the most advantaged group members.
Typically, yes. Often, white, heterosexual, cisgender, able-bodied men are treated as the default or the norm. This means that if you're a member of a marginalized group who achieves success in an area dominated by the privileged group, you're often seen as an exception to the rule.
Not as representative of your group's potential, but as an anomaly.
Precisely. Your success gets individualized, explained away, rather than challenging the negative stereotype about your group as a whole.
The source material actually provides a really vivid example of this intersectional complexity. There's a table comparing stereotypes for men and women across different ethnic groups. And it really shows that the stereotypes aren't just additive, like race plus gender stereotype. They blend to create totally unique, sometimes contradictory profiles.
That table is very revealing. Let's maybe contrast a couple from the source material to illustrate. Consider the stereotype listed for a Black female. Attributes like big butt, confident, hair weavers, assertive. Now compare that to the stereotype listed for an Asian male. Small build, speak English with accent, studious, effeminate.
Okay, those are incredibly different profiles. If the underlying prejudice is supposedly rooted in just race, non-white, why are the stereotypes for the Asian male and the Black female, both non-white groups, so profoundly different? They even seem contradictory in some ways, like assertiveness versus effeminacy, or assumptions about physical build.
It perfectly illustrates intersectionality. You cannot view race or gender in isolation. The intersection creates these hyperspecific, culturally constructed expectations. The stereotype of the Asian male, in this context, is often constructed in contrast to the dominant white male ideal, emphasizing perceived lack of physical power or adherence to studious roles. The stereotype of the black female is often constructed around different tropes, perhaps relating to perceived emotional expression or physical attributes, again often in contrast to white female stereotypes.
Or compare the attributes listed for a Latino male, things like violent, drunks, jealous, versus a Latina female, feisty, curvy, good cooks, sexually conservative.
Again, a huge difference driven by the intersection. Here, the gender stereotype applied to Latina women perhaps softens or changes the harsher criminal or aggressive associations sometimes applied to Latino men in stereotypes, though both sets of stereotypes are clearly restrictive and problematic. The entire profile, the perceived threat level, the expected social role, the assumed characteristics changes instantly based on that intersection of ethnicity and gender.
So intersectionality is crucial because it rejects that idea that a person's experience can be defined by just one singular identity category. If the stereotypic expectation for one part of your identity, say your gender, clashes with the expectation for another part, like your ethnicity or class, you face this really complex, unique matrix of prejudice and expectation.
That's the core insight. It demands a more nuanced analysis than looking at single categories alone.
Okay, this brings us naturally to the isms: racism, sexism, ageism, etc. The sources define these isms as something more than just simple prejudice, right?
They're more. The isms are definitely based on prejudice, the negative attitude. But they combine that individual attitude with entire belief system and ideology that's rooted in notions of group superiority and the right to dominate.
It's just prejudice plus power and ideology.
Essentially, yes. They're rooted in the conviction, often unstated, of the natural or inherent superiority of one's own group, and often include a desire to maintain that group's power and dominate others. It's prejudice embedded within a system of power and social hierarchy.
The most researched of these, certainly in the sources we looked at, is racism. Why does research often seem to center so heavily on anti-Black prejudice, particularly in the U.S. context?
There are several historical and social reasons outlined. Primarily in the U.S., anti-Black prejudice is often seen as the foundational form of racism, starting with the institution of slavery and serving as its primary justification for centuries.
Right. It was built into the country's origins.
Exactly. It's deeply pervasive as a result. And its manifestation has shifted over time from the blatant, legally sanctioned racism of the Jim Crow era to more subtle, often systemic forms today. This evolution makes it a critical, complex, and ongoing area of study.
Okay. And the sources also acknowledge a gap in the research.
Yes, they make a point of noting that research into the attitudes and behaviors of minority group members toward white people has been, historically, significantly ignored or downplayed by academia. That's an acknowledged limitation of the field.
And contrasting with racism, the sources also provide a definition for the ideal goal state, the anti-racist. What does that entail?
Drawing on scholars like Ibram X. Kendi, an anti-racist isn't just someone who isn't overtly racist. It's someone who actively supports anti-racist policies through their actions or expresses anti-racist ideas. It requires an active stance.
So it's about action, not just belief.
Yes. Anti-racists acknowledge the reality of systemic inequity. They acknowledge their own potential biases, but they actively commit to identifying and dismantling policies and practices that perpetuate racial inequality. It's about actively working against the system of racism.
Okay. Moving to other major isms, gender and sexual orientation are obviously huge areas of prejudice. Prejudice against women, sexism has existed.
Yeah.
Well, forever, it seems.
Since the origins of Western culture, certainly. And the sources emphasize that this prejudice, sexism, often manifests in a complex duality. There are both hostile and benevolent components.
Hostile sexism seems straightforward, overtly negative attitude towards derogation. But benevolent sexism, that sounds deceptively positive. How does benevolent sexism actually restrict women?
That's why it's insidious. Benevolent sexism often frames women in ways that seem positive on the surface, pure, delicate, nurturing, morally superior, perhaps. But that seemingly positive view is restrictive because it simultaneously casts women as weak, maybe less competent in supposedly masculine domains like leadership or STEM fields, and ultimately needing protection and paternalistic guidance from men.
Ah, so the protection reinforces dependence and limits autonomy.
Exactly. Both hostile and benevolent sexism, despite their different tones, serve the same ultimate function. They reinforce traditional gender hierarchies and restrict women's full autonomy and equality.
And the sources also note the widespread prejudice faced by transgender individuals whose gender identity doesn't align with the sex they were assigned at birth.
Yes, transgender and gender nonconforming individuals face extremely high rates of prejudice and discrimination globally. This is often tied into the broader concept of heterosexism.
Define heterosexism for us.
Heterosexism is defined as the overarching ideological system that denies, denigrates, and stigmatizes any non-heterosexual behavior, relationship, identity, or community. It operates like the cultural default setting, assuming heterosexuality is the only valid norm, thereby marginalizing LGBTQ plus individuals and experiences.
Okay. And finally, let's just briefly categorize the remaining major targets mentioned. We have ageism,
Which involves negative reactions, stereotypes, and discrimination toward older people, though sometimes toward younger people too.
ableism,
That's prejudice and discrimination against people with disabilities, often based on assumptions about incompetence or viewing disability as solely negative.
and lookism, prejudice based on looks.
Yes, prejudice based purely on physical appearance, favoring those who meet current societal standards of attractiveness and discriminating against those who don't.
We also need to include classism.
Right. Prejudice based on a person's social class, their position in the socioeconomic hierarchy. The sources note that attitudes toward the poor in many Western societies are overwhelmingly negative, often blaming individuals for their poverty and viewing it as a sign of moral failing.
Whereas attitudes toward the affluent.
Often mixed, but generally more positive. Wealth is sometimes viewed, implicitly or explicitly, as evidence of inherent virtue, hard work, or intelligence, often ignoring systemic factors.
And last but not least, religious prejudice.
Yes, prejudice based on religious affiliation or belief. This has existed for centuries, obviously, and fueled countless conflicts. It's perhaps studied slightly less extensively in social psychology compared to racial prejudice, and its specific targets and forms vary widely cross-culturally, but its impacts on identity, conflict, and discrimination remain incredibly severe globally.
Okay, we have defined the concepts SPD. We've cataloged the many targets and explored intersectionality and the isms. Now we have to tackle that fundamental why. Why do these phenomena exist? Social scientists have wrestled with this for over 100 years.
Indeed. And we need to preface this section by noting what the sources themselves say. Current theories tend to explain only pieces of the puzzle. There's no single grand overarching theory that perfectly explains all forms of prejudice everywhere.
Right. Each theory offers a different lens.
Exactly. And another crucial caveat the sources mention is that a lot of this historical research, especially the foundational stuff, was predominantly focused on North America and Western Europe. So the global applicability of some of these theories needs to be considered carefully.
Okay, noted. Let's start at the beginning then. The early attempts to explain prejudice before the 1920s, which fall under the heading of scientific racism.
Right. And, well, scientific racism sounds like an oxymoron today, and frankly, it was.
Less like science, more like justification.
That's exactly what it was. Its entire focus, its purpose, was to interpret or even manipulate research results, specifically to show minority groups in a negative light. Prejudice, in this view, was seen as a natural, even rational response to supposedly backward or inferior peoples.
So the premise was toxic from the start.
Completely. It was a self-serving attempt by the dominant group, using the mantle of science, to try and prove their own inherent superiority, and therefore justify the existing social order, things like slavery, colonialism, segregation. It was ideology disguised as science.
Thankfully, that view eventually collapsed under scrutiny. This led, the sources say, to the rise of psychodynamic theory from roughly the 1920s to the 1950s. This seems like a radical shift in perspective.
It was a huge shift to completely flip the script. Psychodynamic approaches viewed prejudice not as natural or rational, but as an irrational and unjustifiable social problem. It was seen more like a pathology, a symptom of unhealthy psychological processes within the individual.
Okay, so the focus shifted from the target group being inferior to the prejudiced person having a psychological issue. How did the mechanism supposedly work in psychodynamic theory?
It's focused on universal psychological processes, often things thought to be motivationally based, like strengthening one's self-esteem, often unconsciously. It drew heavily on Freudian ideas like defense mechanisms.
Defense mechanisms.
Like projection. Exactly. For example, the idea was that people might displace their own frustrations, anxieties, or aggression onto weaker, safer targets, typically outgroups, rather than confronting the real source of their problems. Or they might project their own unacceptable negative traits, like aggression or laziness, onto an outgroup. By doing this, they protect their own ego, discharge negative feelings, and maintain a more positive self-identity, albeit in a distorted way. It moved the primary source of prejudice entirely inside the individual's mind.
But if the source is just seen as individual pathology, it kind of misses the bigger picture, right? The cultural environment people live in.
That was the major criticism. It couldn't easily explain why prejudice was so widespread, why certain groups were targeted consistently across a whole society. That leads us to the next major shift, the sociocultural theory, which really gained prominence in the 1960s.
And this offered that necessary external correction.
Precisely. The sociocultural theory argued that prejudice isn't primarily about individual psychology, but about the social environment. It stated that culture provides the stereotypes, the norms, the values that lead to prejudice. It explicitly tied stereotyping and prejudice directly to the culture and structure of society itself.
So prejudice is learned.
Fundamentally, yes. In this view, individuals learn prejudice because it's embedded in the cultural norms, the values, the socialization processes they grow up with. It's learned behavior, adopted from the environment, from parents, peers, media, institutions. It's part of conforming to the cultural milieu.
Okay, that makes sense. Then in the 1970s, the focus shifted again more towards intergroup relations theory, emphasizing conflict and competition between groups.
Correct. This perspective posits that prejudice fundamentally derives from the perception of competition, real or perceived, between different groups over limited resources.
Resources like jobs or political power or social status.
Exactly. Any valued commodity that groups might see themselves competing for. And within this broad framework, we see two particularly influential theories emerging.
Okay, that's the first one.
First is relative deprivation theory. This theory suggests that prejudice results not necessarily from absolute poverty or lack of resources, but from the feeling of being deprived relative to another group. It's that intense resentment that arises when one group believes that another group is unfairly receiving more resources, more benefits, or getting some kind of undeserved advantage compared to their own group.
So it's the perception of unfairness. They are getting something that should be mine feeling.
Precisely. That feeling of relative deprivation fuels hostility and prejudice toward the group perceived as the competitor or the unfairly advantaged beneficiary.
Okay. And the second major pillar under intergroup relations.
That would be social identity theory. This theory, developed by Henri Tajfel and John Turner, is incredibly influential and connects group relations directly to our self-concept. The core idea is that people strive for a positive self-identity, a sense of self-worth.
Right.
And a significant part of our identity comes from the groups we belong to, our in-groups, our nation, our team, our ethnicity, etc. So we achieve a positive self-identity, in part, by feeling positively about our in-groups.
How does that lead to prejudice?
Because to feel good about our group, we often engage in comparisons with other groups, out-groups. We seek what they call positive distinctiveness. We find ways to view our in-group favorably, often by finding ways to distinguish our group positively from relevant out-groups. And sometimes the easiest way to make our group look good is to make the other group look bad, perhaps by emphasizing their negative traits or downplaying their positive ones. In-group favoritism and out-group derogation can both serve to boost collective self-esteem.
So liking my group might involve disliking or at least devaluing your group, just to make mine seem better by comparison?
That's the potential mechanism social identity theory highlights.
Okay, moving into the 1980s and continuing to the present, the focus seems to have shifted quite strongly towards cognitive theory. This feels very relevant to our earlier discussion of stereotypes as mental shortcuts and implicit bias.
Absolutely. The cognitive theory, or cognitive perspective, took a fundamentally different stance again. In some ways, it's a more pessimistic view, suggesting that stereotyping at least is universal and perhaps even inevitable.
Why inevitable?
The premise is that stereotyping is a normal, unavoidable consequence of the way our brains process information. It's seen as a basic cognitive process that helps us simplify a massively complex social world. Our brains are cognitive misers. They look for ways to save mental effort.
Efficiency machines.
Right. And it is cognitively simpler, less effortful, to categorize people into groups and assume all members of a group are similar, using a mental shortcut, a schema, a stereotype, rather than processing the unique complexity of every single individual we encounter. The stereotype acts as a default setting.
So the brain uses stereotypes because they're efficient, a way to manage information overload, not necessarily because of malice or deep-seated hatred, at least initially.
That's the core idea of the cognitive perspective. doesn't excuse prejudice or discrimination, but it suggests that the underlying process of categorization and stereotyping is rooted in normal cognitive functioning. This links directly to why implicit biases are so pervasive and hard to eliminate. They might be tapping into these fundamental categorization processes.
Okay. And running parallel to this, also from the 1980s to the present, was the emergence of evolutionary theory as an explanation.
Yes, evolutionary psychology offers another lens. What does it suggest about prejudice?
It applies principles of evolution and natural selection to understand human psychology. It suggests that many of our basic behaviors and psychological tendencies stem from psychological mechanisms that evolved over millennia because they helped our ancestors survive and reproduce.
So how does that apply to prejudice? The argument, put simply, is that a certain degree of suspicion, caution, or even fear of strangers or outgroups might have been adaptive in our deep ancestral past.
Adaptive how?
Well, strangers could potentially carry diseases to which the local group had no immunity, or they can be scouts for a rival group planning to raid resources, or they might pose other threats. So a psychological mechanism that made people cautious or biased in favor of their own known kin group and wary of unfamiliar outsiders might have provided a survival advantage, protecting individuals and communities from harm.
So it's like an ancient survival mechanism.
That's the hypothesis. Today, in our complex, diverse, globalized world, that ancient mechanism might be misfiring. It might be triggering prejudice and hostility toward perceived outgroups who pose no actual threat whatsoever. But the underlying psychological reflex, evolved for a different environment, might remain active deep within our psychology.
Wow. So from scientific racism justifying the status quo, to individual pathology, to cultural learning, to intergroup competition, to cognitive efficiency, and finally to ancient survival instincts, it really covers a huge range of explanations.
And likely, the reality is a complex interplay of many of these factors, depending on the specific context, the specific groups involved, and the specific individual. So we have really completed quite a significant journey in this deep dive, haven't we?
We certainly have.
We moved from those stark, tragic, very real examples of injustice, thinking about the Jena 6 case, the disparity in coverage between Kent State and Jackson State, which grounded us in the ongoing reality. Then we move through the really crucial structural definitions. What race is socially versus biologically, the role of cultures, the difficult concept of privilege. Then we spent significant time dissecting SPD, stereotype, prejudice, discrimination, getting those definitions clear.
The belief, the attitude, the behavior.
Exactly. And finally, we traced that whole historical progression of psychological and sociological thought, trying to explain why these phenomena persist.
Yeah, that evolution of theory was fascinating.
It really is fascinating to trace that intellectual shift, from viewing prejudice as something natural, even justifiable, back in the era of scientific racism.
Which is horrifying to think about now.
Absolutely. To then seeing it as an individual pathology, like in psychodynamic theories, then shifting the focus to something learned purely from culture and sociocultural views, and then more recently, exploring explanations rooted in intergroup competition, or even seeing parts of it as almost inherent to our basic cognitive architecture or evolutionary history.
Right.
Regardless of which theoretical mechanism or combination of mechanisms you find most compelling, the source material's core takeaway seems crystal clear. These concepts, stereotyping, prejudice, discrimination, are profoundly embedded. They're reinforced by culture, they interact with personality, they're triggered by social situations, and they manifest systemically, resulting in pervasive discrimination and inequality.
And reflecting on it all, what really stands out to me is getting that crucial differentiation locked down. Stereotype as the cognitive belief or shortcut, prejudice as the effective attitude rooted in emotion, and discrimination as the resulting harmful behavior.
That distinction is fundamental.
And also, the sheer complexity revealed by intersectionality, the fact that you can't just look at race or just gender or just class in isolation. They overlap, they interact, they create wholly unique, specific stereotypes and experiences of prejudice. We absolutely cannot understand the reality without looking at those intersections. This clarity feels essential.
It really is.
This whole exploration, it feels like it was absolutely necessary groundwork for understanding the what and the why of inequality, of how these systems operate. But importantly, the sources don't just leave us there feeling overwhelmed, perhaps. They prompt that massive, really proactive question that we have to carry forward from here.
The ultimate question, really.
And it's the one we really want to encourage you, the listener, to keep mulling over, maybe until our next deep dive. How can prejudice and discrimination actually be reduced?
That question really frames the challenge, doesn't it? For social scientists, for educators, for policymakers, for all of us as individuals and communities. How do we intervene effectively? The next logical step, as suggested by the source material, is to start exploring the contributions of those social scientists who have actually researched and proposed concrete interventions and potential solutions.
Right. What actually works?
What does the evidence suggest might work? We will save that deep dive, exploring those potential solutions and strategies for reduction, for next time.
Excellent. Well, thank you for joining us for this really essential conversation today.